Hello and welcome to the White House 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, President of the White House Historical Association. Today we are at the magnificent First Baptist Church of the city of Washington, D.C., just about a mile away from the White House. The First Baptist Church was the spiritual home for the Carter family when they lived in Washington. As President-elect, Jimmy Carter attended services here before his inauguration, and during the 48 months that he was President of the United States, he attended more than 70 Sunday services. And he even taught a Sunday school class here a few dozen times from the sanctuary balcony. President Jimmy Carter and First Lady Rosalynn Carter were known for living their lives in deep faith. So we thought it would be fitting and important and insightful to discuss the Carter legacy here with our guest, award-winning author, political analyst, and documentary filmmaker, Jonathan Alter. Jonathan has written New York Times best-selling books about Presidents Obama and FDR. His most recent book is a biography called His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. Jonathan spent many years interviewing over 200 people for this book, and he had extensive access and unique access to the former president and his family. Well, this book provides a fresh and comprehensive look at our 39th president, a man born before the Great Depression, who left the family peanut farm and became a naval nuclear engineer, governor of the state of Georgia, and then president of the United States, and a Nobel Peace Prize winner for his humanitarian work and efforts to find a peaceful solution to international conflicts. Jonathan and I will sit down and talk more about the life and legacy of President Jimmy Carter, but first we'll be joined by Reverend Julie Pennington Russell, known by many here as Pastor Julie. Pastor Julie is the senior minister of the First Baptist Church of the city of Washington, D.C., and we're very fortunate to be able to highlight and bring to you some of the memorabilia preserved by the church which commemorates the Carter family experience here at First Baptist, and to also share with you a special tour of this sacred space. So let's go and see Pastor Julie. So here we are at the First Baptist Church of the city of Washington, just up 16th Street, not even a mile from the White House. And it's in this extraordinarily beautiful house of worship that in January of 1977, just after he was inaugurated President of the United States, President Jimmy Carter began a time of worship. We're here today with Pastor Julie, who is the current pastor of the church. Of course, was not at that time, but has inherited the mantle of the history of the Carters and the history of this church. And we're so thrilled to have you talking with us today. And of course, Jonathan Alter, who knows the president so well and has written so beautifully about his life, his leadership, and his legacy. But let's talk about his faith and the physical elements of this church that are remembered as iconic spaces related to President Carter. And let's start here at the pew.
Absolutely. The Carter family joined the church on the very first Sunday of his presidency. And this is the pew that they loved to sit in. Nothing particularly special about the pew except that it had an unobstructed view of George Washington Carver up in the stained glass, perhaps the most famous peanut farmer.
And he worshiped here how much during those 4 years of his presidency?
During the 48 months that he was president, he worshiped here at least 70 times and taught Sunday school at least 16 times of those 48 months. So very special for the church.
Wow,
as
it
you
sure
can
is.
imagine.
And so would President Carter, Mrs. Carter, Amy, other members of the family, would his mother come with him?
I'm sure
from
Ms.
time to
Lillian
time?
was in the pew with him sometimes. Amy also often had friends come home to stay with her at the White House, and they would come to church with them.
Well, they joined this church, and I understand you have some items that archive that element of the participation here. Can you show those to us?
I do. Would
Great.
love to. Per Baptist custom, when they joined the church, they would have walked down the center aisle and would have presented themselves for membership, and the congregation would have given some indication of their affirmation of God's leading them to the church. And then they were asked, along with everybody else who would have joined that day, to fill out a little membership card. And these are the very cards. You can see President Carter's signature there. And
now I noticed the check mark of letter. That would be a letter of transfer from their church where they were a member. But on Amy's, it says baptism.
That's right.
Tell us about that.
When Amy joined the church or came to present herself for membership, she had not yet been baptized. And so she checked baptism. And then 2 weeks later, on the first Sunday in February, she was baptized right up there.
Wow.
And at that time, she would have been 9 years old.
She was.
That's remarkable.
Right. Yeah.
And to see her recently at Mrs. Carter's funeral as a grown woman and in her own right. And
that's right.
We, in our mind's eye, we still think of Amy as this young girl.
Exactly.
But clearly she's gone on to have a full and long and rich life of her own.
Yeah.
Well, I would love to see the baptistry if you would share that with us.
Happy to.
Wonderful.
Happy to.
Wonderful. Wow, look at this.
So these are the stairs into the baptistry. And then as you can see, you can look out at the congregation that's very much ready to observe and to affirm. Amy and the pastor stood here in the baptistry, and the pastor would have asked Amy the question that Christians have been asked for centuries: what is your profession of faith? And the simple response is, Jesus Christ is Lord. And at that point, the pastor put Amy beneath the water, lowered her under, and then brought her back up, and would have said, you are buried with Christ in baptism and raised to walk in a brand new life.
Wow. And President and Mrs. Carter would have been in that pew where we began and watched this from there?
President Carter was there. Mrs. Carter was standing in the wing, so she would have been closest of all to witness the baptism, and then she was there for Amy to help her out and to help her get changed into dry clothes.
Wow, very special, very special.
One of our members who ran audiovisual was there that Sunday, and he said that one of the Amy's Secret Service agent was here and got just a little bit nervous when the pastor was about to put her under the water. And so our beloved church member had to assure him he will bring her back up.
That's great. And who was the pastor at that time of the church?
Charles Trenham was the pastor then, so he would have been the one to baptize.
Wow, and he would have been pastor during the time of those 4 years of the presidency.
He was, yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing this with us. This is a unique vantage point into the life of a presidential family member.
This
is very special.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So we have now ascended up into the balcony at the rear of the sanctuary, and we are in the space where President Carter would have taught a Sunday school class at least 16 times, I believe.
Perhaps more.
Tell us about this space and how he would have used it.
What I understand is that standing here was preferable to the Secret Service, that he would be hidden, because there were always a number of people gathering for worship who would come early and wanted to be in worship with the president. The space was larger then because we didn't have organ pipes at that time that are here now, and so it was quite a large class. He taught the couples class, which began in the 1940s when lots of people were arriving, young couples in DC, and so this would have been about 30 years later. So it was middle-aged folk, but some of those came to be good friends with him. And so he would teach from here. He loved to keep a conversational style. He loved to ask questions. He would teach, and he always studied and came very well prepared. I don't think he rehashed old material. He would come and do his due diligence, and then he would throw out questions that would invite people to share from their own perspective. And so sometimes it was a very lively conversation.
You know, one thing that is astonishing to me is that the process you just described is exactly what he was doing when he was in his early 90s at Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia. He would never phone it in or rehash. On Saturday night, he would leave whatever he was doing a little early to go home and prepare his lesson.
And Jonathan, I've never had the privilege of hearing him deliver a Sunday school lesson. You have. What was that like to sit and listen to him teach?
I think it might best be described as a warm, highly educational and inspiring experience, no matter what faith one came from, what faith tradition. And in Plains, there would be people there from all over the world, and he would ask before starting the class where everybody was from, and people would shout out. And then he would start the lesson. It was very accessible, homespun without being conspicuously so, really kind of pitch perfect for what you would want from something like that. Often about St. Paul. He had a particular interest in teaching about St. Paul and his experiences, but he drew on all of the Gospels and from the Old Testament as well.
Do you know that he ever had any interest in or sensed any calling himself to go into the ministry or to become a pastor?
So yes, and in my biography, I recount a chapter in his life where he is urged by a friend who's a major pastor in Georgia and told that he could have a big future if he wanted to do this, that he was well equipped for that. But by that time, he had already decided, and this was when he was in his 30s, he had already decided that he was going to go into politics, and he explained it by saying that he would have a much larger congregation.
I was about to say, no more difficult of a mission field than American politics, probably.
Right. But he was arguably the most devout of all American presidents, and he prayed many times a day.
In this space, the week after, the Sunday after the Camp David Peace Accords, President Carter comes here, and
He did. He began the Bible study that morning by saying lightheartedly, he says, well, it's always nice to come back from a 2-week vacation at Camp David. Of course, everybody laughed, and the lesson that day was called Facing Life's Tensions. And so you can imagine the personal stories that he told that day. And one of them, he simply said, some of the most unpleasant moments of my life were spent during these past 2 weeks, also some of the most pleasant. And when he talked about the inspiring moments for himself, he said that both Sadat and Begin spent much of the time in prayer, as did he. He talked about how they all believed that they worshiped the same God. They drew from their similarities, not from their divisions, and so it was a marvelous moment.
He believed that there would have not been any Camp David Accords if it was not for this commonality in the Abrahamic traditions.
Right.
And he didn't have them together. They had just fought 3 wars against each other. And so he learned early in the conference that he had to keep them apart. Right. And so it wasn't until the end when they came together. But there was a moral and religious imperative that suffused the whole meeting. One of the most soulful moments of the 13 days at Camp David, which did take on almost a spiritual quality, was when they went on a field trip to Gettysburg. And that was one occasion when all 3 of them were in the same place. They took a kind of a break from the very intense negotiations that were taking place. And Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, started reciting the Gettysburg Address
Oh my goodness.
by heart. And according to everybody, including Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian leader, this was a very moving, almost spiritual moment, and they felt the presence of Lincoln. And I think they all also, having studied the Battle of Gettysburg, they felt the presence of the dead.
let's talk about another moment in presidential history, and it's the election of 1980. And President Carter has been through a very difficult, challenging campaign against Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California. The hostages still held in Iran at that point up until Inauguration Day in 1981. And after it's clear that President Carter and Mrs. Carter will be leaving Washington, how did they say goodbye to this church home that they had enjoyed and become literally a member part of during their time here?
Well, during the Sunday school class on the Sunday shortly after the election, he simply said something to the effect of course, we are disappointed, and we plan, this is not goodbye, we will be with you for several more weeks before we leave, and we won't be able to sustain this level of intensity the whole time. So let us just say how much you mean to us, and we'll continue. And now let's get on with the Bible study. And so very, very gracious about it. And,
That's wonderful.
And of course, before they left, they were able, both in writing and verbally, to express to the congregation all that they had meant. President Carter said at one point in the first year of their coming, he said, "You have made our lives normal lives." He said, "The life of a president can be very difficult to negotiate, but you have made this a place of normalcy for us, and that has meant the world."
Sometimes presidents will use an excuse, forgive my use of that word, that going to church as president is an imposition or an inconvenience to other worshipers. Did President Carter feel that, or did the service ever impede his attending worship here?
We don't have the sense that that was the case at all. He would come, and obviously there was sometimes a circus-like effect, and depending on what was going on, there sometimes even would be protesters outside and would make their way inside and would have to be kindly asked to depart. And of course the Secret Service and police were here. But President Carter really made it a point simply to practice his faith. He would teach, they would make their way to the pew, they would worship, he would listen, they would sing, and then they would go home. And I think that really was an anchor for the family.
Wow.
Yeah.
Place is so important in history, and to be in this place that was important to President Carter, you can almost hear his voice in teaching and sharing his heart and those lessons in Sunday school. And thank you for sharing this place with us. This is very meaningful to hear your insights and reflections on behalf of this historic church, and such a place that was so important to President and Mrs. Carter during their presidency.
You're so very welcome. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
So thank you, Jonathan, for being with us here today, and your voice and perspective and really relationship with President Carter inspired and informed this volume, and we're so honored to have this conversation with you.
Well, thanks for having me, Stuart.
Tell us how you first came to be interested in President Carter and got to know him, and what led to this wonderful book.
I was for more than 20 years a columnist for the old Newsweek magazine, and I interviewed President Carter in 2000 on a Habitat for Humanity site. Many years later, when I was working on the book, I helped him build a house in Memphis. And I had been, when I was in college, I was an intern in the speech writing office of the Carter
During the Carter
White
presidency.
House in 1978. So I had a little bit of a connection to him, but I didn't really know him. And then in 2015, I'm in a book group in New York City, and we had somebody who knew Jimmy Carter's grandson, Jason Carter, who had just run for governor of Georgia, and he and his grandfather came over and they talked all evening about Camp David and the Camp David Accords. And Carter at that time was 90 years old, and it felt like a master class that we were getting from an enormously intelligent former American president. And I just thought to myself, there has to be more to this guy than mediocre president, fantastic former president, which is what you hear from everybody. That has to be simplistic. And it just has to be wrong on some level. And I started, working on the book, and fortunately, was able to get a lot of access. And I spent about 5 years doing a very deep dive into the epic American life of Jimmy and Rosalind Carter.
I believe that the places and people in our lives that form us and help make us who we are so important. And clearly, the place for Jimmy Carter is Plains, Georgia. You've been there and you've seen and experienced that place of his beginning and the place of his latter days. Tell us about Plains and what is magical and what you think helped make Jimmy Carter who he was.
It's a town of only about 650 people and one flashing stoplight. That's it. It has a pull on both President and Mrs. Carter because that's who they are on some level. But what is fascinating about them is that they both wanted to get out of Plains when they were young, and to the end of their lives, they were very involved in doing anything they could to improve Plains, Georgia. And while they traveled very, very widely when he was a former president, they would always go home to Plains for a sense of repose and comfort they drew there.
With Pastor Julie, we talked about the impact of faith in President Carter's life. Let's talk a little bit about family and his father and what type of man he was, his reputation in the community, and his influence on a young Jimmy Carter.
Earl Carter was a successful merchant and farmer in that area. And Jimmy actually grew up in Archery, Georgia, just outside Plains.
A suburb of Plains, Georgia.
Well, to call it a suburb would be a lot. There were about 15 families living there, most of them black, many of them working on the Carter farm. And Carter grew up, it might as well have been the 19th century. No mechanized farm equipment, no running water or electricity until he was 11 years old. And Earl Carter was a civic leader, but he was also a white supremacist. And in contrast, Jimmy's mother, Ms. Lillian Gordy Carter, she was a nurse who took care of black patients for free. And then there was really a third parent, a woman named Rachel Clark, who was an illiterate black woman farmhand who taught Jimmy Carter much of his faith and also his love of nature. And Carter grew up to be one of our most important environmentalist presidents. He signed 14 major pieces of environmental legislation, doubled the size of the National Park Service when he was president. A lot of that began with Rachel Clark and also with his father, who would take him hunting and fishing. But because of their differences on race, his relationship with his father was estranged until his father came down with pancreatic cancer in the early 1950s, and Jimmy quit the Navy to go assume his responsibilities. And then it turned out that all three of his siblings also died of pancreatic cancer. He escaped that fate. He always said and told me that he thought it was because he didn't smoke.
So what was the work life and the work ethic like for a young Jimmy Carter?
So when he was very young, all he wanted to do was to be a farmer like his father. And his father drove him very hard, and he learned how to do everything imaginable on the farm, learned the value of very hard work and how to connect to the often illiterate black farmhands who, after they were teenagers, his father wouldn't let them in the house. That's how segregated things were. But for much of his early life, he had this experience of barefoot most of the year, working the land.
Got his hands dirty.
Yes, to put it mildly. And there would be humiliating experiences because his father believed that there was always a reckoning. That was the title of Carter's book of poetry that he wrote after the presidency. Carter was famously thrifty. He would annoy Rosalind Carter by turning down the thermostat in the White House and making sure that the staff didn't subscribe to too many newspapers. The taxpayer shouldn't pay for all that. And he learned this from his father. And at one point, his father, who was in many different businesses, he made women's shoes, cobbled them on their farm. And they didn't sell that year in town. So he made Jimmy wear them to school, these turn of the century high button women's shoes. And of course he was teased. They called him Pee Wee because he was shorter than the other kids. But he learned drive. And he had a wonderful teacher who he quoted in his inaugural address, the only president ever to quote a teacher in his inaugural address. And so he was getting, while he was learning the value of hard work, he was also understanding that there was this wider world and that he wanted to join.
Rosalind Carter also felt compelled to leave Plains. Why was that?
It could be stifling, and to have both her mother and her mother-in-law there, and she wanted to see the world, and they went all over the world when he was in the Navy, and she loved it.
So they knew each other for 96 years. Tell us about that relationship.
So Jimmy Carter was born in 1924, and his mother was a nurse, and when he was 2.5 years old, Ms. Lillian went over to a family named Smith, and she delivered a baby girl named Rosalind Smith, and she brought her toddler over to see the new baby. And Jimmy and Rosalind Carter actually first met 96 years
Amazing.
before Mrs. Carter died.
Amazing.
Just a couple of days after she was born.
And you mentioned that both of them wanted to get out of Plains, wanted to leave.
Yeah.
When he went to the Naval Academy, was it purely for education, or was it to pursue a Navy career? And did he see that his ticket out of Plains?
Yes. So he had an uncle who was taken prisoner during World War II, who was in the Navy, who sent him mementos from all over the world and fired his imagination from the 30s. And he very early on decided that he wanted to be a midshipman at Annapolis. And he was the only kid in his high school who went to college. And he aimed even higher for Annapolis. And he wanted to be chief of naval operations, an admiral. That was his ambition. And to see the world like his uncle. Initially, his congressman wouldn't recommend him. You have to be recommended to service academies. And so he went to Georgia, what's now Georgia Southwestern State University, and then Georgia Tech. Twice, his congressman said, you need more preparation before you can go to the Naval Academy. And then he arrives there in the middle of World War II, and they're on an accelerated schedule, and he graduates in 3 years.
He was a nuclear Navy officer and a protege of Admiral Rickover, which is extraordinary.
The nuclear Navy, nuclear-powered submarines, was kind of like the Apple computer of the middle part of the 20th century. It was the most exciting tech project imaginable. They were putting a nuclear power plant on a submarine when they didn't even have one generating power on land yet. That's how early it was. Colin Powell later said that what Rickover did as much as anything to win the Cold War, because we were able to develop nuclear-powered submarines and the Soviets were not. So he interviews for this, and Rickover was a famous curmudgeon, and he would do things like, in the interview he'd say, go open the window, and the window would be nailed shut, and he wanted to see how you react. And Carter thought he hadn't gotten in, because after being quizzed very intently on everything from classical music, when he said he liked a piece of classical music, Rickover would say, which movement, And Rickover says, well, where did you graduate in your class at the Naval Academy? And he said, I was 39th out of 600 and something. He thought that was pretty good. Rickover looks at him, he says, did you do your best? And Carter says, well, I guess I didn't always do my best. And he says, why not your best? And he turns around, the interview's over. And so I maintain, and the reason I call my book his very best, that from that day in 1951 throughout the rest of his life, whatever Jimmy Carter was doing, whether it was deciding how to bring peace between Israel and Egypt or fly fishing,
Yes.
he was all in.
We talked about Jimmy Carter knowing Rosalind Carter from their earliest days, but yet they did not date until he was a midshipman at the Naval Academy. What led to that change in their acquaintance?
He just saw her as one of his sister's friends and didn't pay much attention to her. But she looked at that picture of him in his uniform that was in their house, and she kind of mooned over that picture. And then when he came home on vacation in 1945, he decided kind of on the spur of the moment to go on a double date with her to a movie that neither of them remember. And he told his mother after the date, that's the woman I'm going to marry.
After the first date, he said this?
Yeah. And he wrote a beautiful poem about it that's in a collection of poetry that he published after the presidency. And not all the poems are great, but the one about his first date with Rosalind is quite beautiful. And then the love letters that he wrote her after they were married.
Amy beautifully read a letter during Mrs. Carter's funeral. And then you shared with me that you had the opportunity to uniquely have access to the letters that he wrote to Mrs. Carter. Tell us about those and what you learned about him and about their relationship.
The letter that Amy read was one of several that Mrs. Carter let me publish for the first time, as actually few people even at the Carter Library knew of their existence before I published them. And they are the most intimate letters ever exchanged between a future president and a future first lady. They make John Adams' letters to Abigail look very tame and ordinary in some ways by comparison. And these are very passionate letters, but they also reflect that they disagreed on certain things and would quarrel, as all couples do, would work it through in their letters and then later in between the two of them, and they developed a certain set of things that they would advise other couples of, like, never go to bed angry and make sure you spend some time apart. Don't be together all the time. And these were things that they learned in that period when he was at sea and he was apart from her. And she's home raising their, at that time, 3 sons. Amy came 13 years after their youngest son. So there are 4 kids, 3 boys and Amy. So she is holding down the fort, and he has a ways to go to evolve into a more modern man. I mean, he could be a very difficult person and sometimes even a cold person. And the smile that everybody remembers, as Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, said, there were really 3 smiles. There was the big public one,
the grin.
Really the grin, the toothy grin. And that was a little bit artificial. And then there was a tight, closed mouth smile, which meant as his eyes, his steely blue eyes were boring into you and the temperature in the room is plummeting. And that meant he was angry at you when he gave you that. And then there was the genuine smile when somebody got off a funny remark or he was enjoying the company of other people. The complexity there really fascinated me. There was nothing about his life that didn't have layers to it, which makes him so wonderful a subject for a biography.
Why did Jimmy Carter leave the Navy?
Because when his father died, it turned out that the business was close to bankruptcy, in part because his father, unbeknownst to Carter until he was on his deathbed, was doing a lot of favors for local people, black and white. So his family needed him to do this. It was the most difficult decision of his life, and early on, they thought they were going to lose the business. And he was on a very fast track in the Navy, but he just felt this sense of family obligation. Rosalind Carter, they got married not long after graduation. She hoped that he would have a long naval career. She really wanted to get out of planes. When he decided to go back, they drove from Schenectady, New York to Plains, Georgia, and she gave him the silent treatment for most of the ride. She'd say to their first son, Jack, Jack, tell your father we need to stop. And she told me that she sulked for a whole year when they got back. And then she really became very engaged in building his business. And Rosalind Carter had a great business head, and she also was the political intelligence in the family.
He leaves the Navy, returns to Plains. The business is in difficulty, but at some point he does run for the school board, and then he becomes governor, and he has success, and he has defeat in electoral politics. But then what finally launched him toward the presidency? What made him think he could be president of the United States?
Carter was elected governor in 1970. He had lost in 1966 and developed a lot of his terrific retail politicking abilities in that second gubernatorial campaign, and got really good at talking, especially to small groups. He was never great on television, but he developed a way of bringing an audience around to him, partly by listening, and good listener. And he would also just do smart little things, like he'd arrive early instead of late. Like a lot of politicians, they want to make a late entrance, So he'd get there early and he'd park himself at the door of the event so that he would greet everybody on the way in. Same way toward the end of his life, when he'd been on an airplane, he'd shake hands with everybody on the plane. And there were always mixed motives for that. It was partly because he was nice, and it was partly because that way he could work uninterrupted, having already shaken everybody's hand. And politically, he understood that there were these tricks, and that you shouldn't say, I want your vote for me, I want your vote. Say, I want you to consider voting for me. And that changed the nature of the interaction. So he had these skills, becomes governor, and it's the run-up to the 1972 presidential election. All the prominent Democrats, almost all of them senators, passed through Atlanta at one time or another, and they go to the governor's mansion, as did Bob Dylan and the Allman Brothers and these musicians that he got quite close to. And Carter takes their measure. Some of them drink too much. Others don't really know anything about where the rubber meets the road the way a governor does. They don't really understand the effect of policy on states and localities. And he says, I'm smarter than a lot of these guys.
Let's talk about the political partnership with Mrs. Carter and President Carter. What was her role, her influence? We talk about many presidents and speculate that maybe they wouldn't have been president had they not been married to this particular woman. What about Mrs. Carter? Was she the wind in his sails, or was she along for the ride?
So Rosalind Carter, and this is not known by very many people, but it's becoming increasingly clear, was among the most influential first ladies in American history. And she not only was a top political advisor and policy advisor to her husband, but his staff, and normally the presidential staff, they don't like the first lady getting too involved. They liked and respected her and always thought that she made an important contribution. And in several areas, she had policy achievements unmatched by, say, Eleanor Roosevelt or Hillary Clinton or Abigail Adams. So the Mental Health Act of 1980, which was the first major piece of mental health legislation in this country, was largely the result of Rosalind Carter's efforts. She and Betty Bumpers, the wife of Senator Dale Bumpers, they went around the country and they convinced dozens of state legislatures to require vaccination for measles, mumps, rubella before kids could enter school. And if you look at the positive economic consequences of that, of lost sick days, where the kids get something and they give it to other people in their family, they give it to other people in the school. Almost incalculable in terms of how it helped children's health. Obviously as controversial then as it is now, but it still took an enormous amount of effort to get this accomplished. And that just scratches the surface of her policy achievements, but in terms of her influence on her husband, he believed that everything he accomplished, he did with her. And it was controversial when he was president because she sat in on cabinet meetings.
Sat in on cabinet meeting.
The cabinet didn't resent it. And she didn't speak at cabinet meetings, but she needed to understand the interplay of policies to do her own policy work. She gave him some advice that he didn't take. She wanted him to wait on certain things for a second term. And he said, well, I got to do it now. And she gave me some of her previously unpublished diaries where she said, I thought that Jimmy was acting a little sanctimonious about that. Like he should have held off on some of these things and then maybe we'd have a better chance of getting reelected. So Jimmy Carter revolutionized the role of First Lady by giving his wife significant policy responsibilities and by allowing her to be such an influential advisor, and first among equals, all of his advisors. But in addition to revolutionizing the role of the First Lady, he revolutionized the role of Vice President. Before Walter Mondale, the Vice Presidency was a backwater, and it was the President really didn't like to see the Vice President very much because he reminded him of his own mortality, right? That was the old joke. And Carter put Mondale in the chain of military command, which had never been done before, and a whole series of other things, which Mondale asked for before he agreed to go on the ticket in 1976. And Carter delivered on that, and it changed the office of Vice President forever. And then after the presidency, of course, he revolutionized the role of the former president. For a one-term president who a lot of people for many years disrespected, even at that structural level, those are big achievements.
Absolutely. Going from living in a simple ranch house in Plains, and of course they lived in the governor's mansion in Atlanta, but they moved to Washington, their president and first lady in the White House. How did that big house fit for them personally? What was life like for them in the White House?
Well, they thoroughly enjoyed it, and they used it to do what a lot of people describe as the most interesting, entertaining since at least the Kennedy administration. And they had, everybody from Dizzy Gillespie to Vladimir Horowitz perform there. But Carter liked to run a tight ship, and he would turn down the thermostat to, save energy, and Rosalind would complain about shivering. And
he would wear his sweater.
Wear his cardigan sweater, which people laughed at later, but was very popular at the time. And he'd take the stairs. He didn't use the elevator. He really didn't like being fussed over by any of the ushers. The variety of people that he had come and often stay there is very interesting. So at one point, Willie Nelson comes, he stays over in the White House, and he's been out of jail for only a short period of time. And he later wrote in his memoirs, I couldn't believe I was sleeping in the White House just after this prison experience. And it's because Jimmy Carter, it was the spirit of the 70s, and Jimmy Carter didn't care. He didn't care if people wanted to criticize that. He wanted to use his time in the White House to basically slake his thirst for life. And he could bring anybody there, and he did.
Give us an overview of how his presidency took shape in terms of the major challenges, how he addressed them, where you think he succeeded, and where he did not.
His first 2 years were quite successful, and he actually put more legislative points on the board than either Barack Obama or Bill Clinton did in 8 years, and he only had 4, just in terms of the major pieces of legislation that were passed. And I think people have these kind of cliches in their head about, he didn't get anything done, he was too attentive to detail. A lot of that was just noise from the period. But there were a series of economic problems, including double-digit inflation and double-digit interest rates. Interest rates went as high as 19%. Try getting reelected in that environment. And then after the hostages were seized in Tehran exactly 1 year before the 1980 election, while at first he was quite popular, there was a rally around the flag effect that helped him beat Ted Kennedy in the primaries. Eventually, Americans got frustrated with the fact that we couldn't get the hostages released. So those factors really hurt him. But I think that journalists and historians have different responsibilities when it comes to American presidents. So when I'm wearing my journalist cap, which I do a fair amount of the time, I'm looking at how is this president connecting to the American people? What are his approval ratings like? That's how journalists define success. Are they popular? And obviously that's relevant, but historians have to put on a different hat and look at how did this president change America and the world? And on that score, Jimmy Carter won't be on Mount Rushmore, but he ranks way higher than most people understand. And there are major foreign policy achievements. So the Camp David Accords that brought peace between Israel and Egypt. Imagine if Israel and Egypt were at war right now, what kind of a mess the Middle East would be. The most durable peace treaty since World War II. Normalization of relations with China. Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter walked through the door that Richard Nixon and Mao Zedong opened. At that time, China had the GDP of a sub-Saharan African country, and the enormous strides that American business took with this bilateral relationship for all of its troubles, that all began with normalization. And it wasn't inevitable. This was a courageous move and unpopular at the time to normalize relations. And imagine if we had the tensions today without diplomatic relations with China, then we'd really be in a mess.
Sure.
And then there are lots and lots of other things. So the first, support for clean energy. I think people know that he put solar panels on the roof of the White House that Ronald Reagan took down. And he began to move us toward energy independence and basically made it possible for utilities to start to use more clean energy and a whole series of other things that were very frustrating at the time. And he made a series of mistakes, political mistakes that hampered him. But overall were taking us in a positive direction. And at the very end of his presidency, his White House issued a report on what was then called carbon pollution or global warming, which had mostly been talked about in the scientific community. And if he'd been reelected, he intended to begin to address climate change and move to electric cars in the early 1980s.
Well, a very difficult re-election campaign in 1980. Ronald Reagan becomes president, and Jimmy and Rosalind Carter return to Plains, and no one had dreamed at that time that they were beginning the longest post-presidency lives of a former president. We know of his success with Habitat for Humanity and how he engaged globally and really set the standard for a post-presidency lifestyle. But how was he viewed by his successors? Was he consulted regularly? Did they seek his counsel and advice as a former president?
A mixed bag. So he was doing a lot on global health, supervising elections, but he was also sometimes operating as almost a kind of freelance Secretary of State. And his successors didn't like that very much, with good reason. But if you look at it in a broader sense, you have to ask, okay, maybe, Bill Clinton's nose is out of joint over Carter kind of freelancing on him. But particularly in 1994, Carter prevented wars in both Haiti and North Korea that year, and he ticked off Clinton by not keeping him informed enough of what he was doing, and maybe going off script a little bit. But he got some big things accomplished. There were other things he tried that didn't work. Not everything he tried as a former president was successful, but he did set a new standard that almost all of his successors, including Bill Clinton, who I saw with Hillary Clinton at the Carter 75th wedding anniversary in 2022, and so they had buried the hatchet, but I think his successors eventually appreciated him.
There came a point where there was a U.S. Navy nuclear submarine named after him. When he was honored in that way, how did that make him feel at that time?
I think he was gratified by that, but what really made him happy is when he could see that their efforts directly helped other people to the very end of their lives. So you'll recall when Jimmy Carter went into hospice, that was very intentional. They wanted to give a boost to the hospice movement. Rosalind Carter got very involved in caregiving. They wanted to put the concept of caregiving, which wasn't really much of a notion until they and others started talking about it in the 1980s, put that on the map. Of all of the honors, I think that the Nobel Peace Prize was the one that he was most proud of. But he wasn't much for that. He was more interested in feeling like he had leveraged his fame and his experience to touch as many lives as he could. And that sounds like a platitude, but that's what got Jimmy and Rosalind Carter up in the morning. He really didn't care all that much about money and luxuries, and other presidents would go on corporate boards and take big speaking fees when they left the White House. And he'd give the speaking fees to the Carter Center, and he made his living as an author from book advances.
Wow, what a life. So every year since 1981, the White House Historical Association has created an annual Christmas ornament. And we feature different presidents sequentially. And this year, in 2024, it's the presidency of Jimmy Carter. And we have the iconic anchor as the symbol, the primary symbol. Anchor is a symbol of hope, and also iconic given his naval service and the importance of the United States Navy in his life. This is something that we'll be talking about throughout the course of this year, and certainly the legacy of the Carters and their influence, and using this as a teaching tool. So look forward to getting you one of these soon.
I think that sounds perfect. He was the first graduate of the Naval Academy to become president of the United States, so far the only graduate to be president. And he was involved in the most exciting military project of the middle part of the 20th century in the Navy, the nuclear Navy. And a lot of people don't know this, but he increased defense spending. And he was a strong believer in a strong but not wasteful national defense.
And I think Admiral Rickover would approve of this design too.
Admiral Rickover would have loved it. And he stayed friendly with Admiral Rickover until the end of Rickover's life. And Admiral Rickover got involved in the 3 Mile Island situation.
Well, presidents are presidents for their times, and they have to play the cards that are dealt to them. Here's a man, life of 100 years, and the presidency is only 4 of those 100. In summary, describe how that 4 stacked up against the success of the other 96.
Well, he was only in politics for 12 years. There were so many other parts of his life that he valued. He's a master woodworker. He built every piece of furniture in his home, and they're beautiful. It's a beautiful coffee table book that he did. He and Mrs. Carter would compete over how many fish they caught. When he was 90, he went fly fishing in Siberia. He had a determination to live life to its absolute fullest, and politics was only part of that. And he was described by a former president of Emory University as the only man who ever used the presidency as a stepping stone.
Wow.
Because he led such an epic life, and because he applied such grit and sometimes off-putting intensity to what he did, he led one of the great American lives beyond having been president of the United States. And a life that, and this is the key thing, is an inspiring life. Just being president doesn't make you an inspiration to people around the world. You know, it's what you do with the power that you've been given to change other people's lives. And if you look at what they've done on global health, on peacekeeping, on democracy promotion, all the big issues of the 21st century, it's a guy who might as well have been born in the 19th century. We haven't seen another president who lived in 3 centuries, except perhaps for Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the only other presidents under whom there was not a single shot fired in anger. Jimmy Carter, Thomas Jefferson, and arguably Calvin Coolidge. That's it. So, you know, that's a pretty major legacy if you believe in life and the importance of human life. And Walter Mondale, as vice president, toasted him at the end of his presidency after he'd had this shellacking from Ronald Reagan. And he said, "We told the truth, we kept the peace, and we obeyed the law." And Carter later added as part of what he thought should be the summary of his presidency, "and we promoted human rights." And you might go, all right, tell the truth, obey the law, you know, keep the peace. It seems kind of a low bar, but I think we've found in the decades since, that's a pretty good record.
Well, thank you for sharing this conversation and your insights in this remarkable place that was important to Jimmy Carter. And we began talking about a man of faith, and we explored a man of family, of leadership, of partnership with Rosalynn, his impact on a country that continues to this day. So thank you for your words of wisdom, and also for this extraordinary book, His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life by Jonathan Alter. Thank you so much. It was great talking with you today.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you all for listening and watching today. Be sure to subscribe to the White House 1600 Sessions on your favorite podcast provider so that you never miss an episode. And please watch the video version on YouTube and Facebook. Your support of the White House Historical Association makes this work possible. When you become an association member, or when you purchase a book or an official White House Christmas ornament, you are helping fund the education mission through our teacher programming, our publishing, and our latest initiative, one that I'm extremely excited about, the People's House, a White House experience. In September 2024, we will launch this new immersive experience at 1700 Pennsylvania Avenue. The People's House will be open to everyone. You can learn more about our work as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization by going to our website, whitehousehistory.org. Thank you very much.